So, what is functional medicine? Welcome to Functional Medicine for Real World Impact, where we're diving into the complex, interconnected nature of health and disease, exploring not just theory, but practically what it takes to turn functional medicine insight into powerful, practical, real world results. So please hit subscribe and let's get started. One of the best ways for me to share what functional medicine is and isn't is with this simple analogy. Now imagine a beautiful little bonsai tree, right? A perfectly formed little tree that we can see is a system, right? There's an organism trying to thrive in a given environment. And we might notice on our little bonsai tree that a leaf or two or three or four have become unhealthy. They may have spots or brownness. There's evidence of dis-ease, of struggle in a particular part of the plant. Well, of course, being a good caretaker of our lovely bonsai, we're going to investigate. And while we're going to keenly look at the leaf itself in order to assess the suffering, assess the disease, when we think about what are we going to do to help the plant to recover from the disease, of course, our assessment is not just going to focus on the leaf. We're going to look at the stem, the stalk, the branches, the trunk, the bark, the quality of the soil, the health of the roots, the amount of water, the amount of food, the quality of the air. What is the planting material? What's the stability of the planter? What types of issues with air quality or sunlight or pests or threats might lurk in the environment? It's a bit of a systems engineering lens on the health or disease of this particular organism. We don't look just at the suffering part, if you will. We look at not only the entire physiological and biochemical system, in the case of human beings, or in the case of the plant, the entire biological or ecological setup. We look at the whole system in order to understand what are the sets of factors that might be creating an environment that is naturally leading to disease in these leaves. It would not be logical for any of us to just take a myopic look at the leaf. We for sure might want to support the leaf. Maybe there's some type of localized treatment that we can apply in order to help the leaf. But it's not logical that the health of the leaf is going to be restored in a resilient and reliable way without us looking at the entire system. This example, our simple analogy for our beloved bonsai tree, well demonstrates the functional medicine lens on health and disease. We want to be looking at all of the different underlying causes and mediators that would cause a system, human physiology and biochemistry, that is designed to thrive, that is designed brilliantly to handle all sorts of different challenges, when it is struggling to do that on an ongoing basis. And we see signs and symptoms, and we have diagnostic agreement on what is a disease and what label do we want to give it. While we may need to treat the disease, and certainly we have plenty of allopathic conventional tools that might be necessary and a blessing in those scenarios, that of course is not nearly enough if we are to do our best work with delivering comprehensive healthcare. We would naturally want to look upstream, to look at the entire system and see what might be at play that needs to be adjusted. Another wonderful example coming into the human body might be the oh so common diagnosis of hypertension or elevated blood pressure. Certainly, we agree on diagnostic criteria for hypertension, and we have assessment tools to help us arrive on this concerning dynamic that we know increases the likelihood of other worse downstream disease, such as atherosclerosis and overt cardiovascular events. But when we look at the state of elevated blood pressure, the functional medicine lens compels us to ask, why? Why does this unique person present with hypertension? And of course, we have to do a deeper dive, because while we might agree that a short-term remedy to treat or minimize the negative effects of the current state of imbalance is a smart idea. And perhaps through the conventional lens, this might be a choice like a given antihypertensive medication, like a beta blocker, or an angiotensin receptor blocker. Or through the more natural or holistic lens, we might agree that every case of hypertension can likely benefit from increased intake of magnesium in order to promote more flexibility of our blood vessels so that they can more readily relax and contract. And we know that magnesium insufficiency is very common in our patient and client demographics. But beyond the immediate remedy, why is this unique person struggling? We start to look at some examples and we see the necessity of assessment and then customized interventional plans, because 3 people could have the exact same state of hypertension. But let's say the first person, Mary, is wrestling because she has elevated blood sugar. Mary might be struggling with prediabetes and her blood sugar has been creeping up because she has a high glycemic load. And over time, this has promoted insulin resistance in her body. And over time, her pancreatic response with insulin has been insufficient and her blood sugar has started to come up and up. And we know that elevated blood sugar can promote glycemic damage to the endothelial function in our arteries, which can lead them to be less responsive to the otherwise flexible contraction and relaxation that we would expect, that we need from our blood vessels. And so we want to help this first woman to overcome the hypertension, then we need to help her address the roots of her elevated blood sugar. And even then, we could go into all sorts of examples. Some people have elevated levels of blood sugar because their diet contains way too many carbohydrates, too many carbohydrate foods, and there's a lot of glycemic load from diet. For other people, that may not be an issue at all, but they may have marked stressors in their life, mental, emotional stressors, or maybe physiological stressors like sleep apnea. But underneath the hypertension, there is a constant surge of stress hormones that naturally are promoting elevated blood sugar in pursuit of supporting more of a sympathetic nervous system response to promote survival. So the elevated blood sugar helps us to fight and flight in the name of survival. But even the reasons, the stressors can really vary differently. You can start to see that there's already different types of bio-individuality internal to the blood sugar challenges that might be a root cause, an underlying driver of the hypertension. But what about if we take a second individual, Bill? Bill doesn't have any trouble with blood sugar at all. In fact, Bill's hemoglobin A1C and fasting glucose and even fasting insulin levels may be optimal. Bill is not struggling. However, Bill has challenges with managing in the body a critical biochemical called homocysteine. Homocysteine is an intermediate of the methylation cycle in the human body, and something that we are just making billions of times a minute in order to support the availability of methyl groups for the body's biochemistry. Well, Bill may not know it, but his homocysteine has been creeping up and is clinically high and is promoting a pro-inflammatory response in the lining of his arteries. Bill may unknowingly have issues with methylation, perhaps because he has some genetic variants that he inherited from his father's side of the family. Turns out there's a strong history of cardiovascular disease there. And Bill already has trouble with metabolizing homocysteine, maybe because of genetic impairment and the enzymes that take care of that. But on the other hand, Bill may also struggle to have adequate nutrition in his body to support methylation. Maybe part of that is because Bill's not bringing on board optimal levels of vitamin B12. Perhaps that's because of his diet. Maybe that's because of his digestion and the fact that Bill wrestles with acid reflux. And so a couple of times a day, Bill is using a medication, a proton pump inhibitor, that is breaking his digestion on purpose. It's creating a suboptimal acidity or a hypochlorhydria in his gastric cavity. And when we have a more alkaline pH in the gastric cavity, we don't get optimal binding of intrinsic factor with vitamin B12 to help ensure optimal absorption of vitamin B12 further down in the intestines. I'm getting into some of the interconnected nature of what might be in play in creating those functional imbalances. So for Bill, his challenges, the reason he has developed hypertension may be because of an inflammatory response in his arteries that is because of elevated levels of homocysteine. But what about Sue? Sue may be a third person. Sue also has no issues at all with her blood sugar, no problems. And she also doesn't have issues with homocysteine. She has an optimal level. There are no known nutrient challenges in that space. But Sue is recently menopausal. And like the vast majority of women going through this natural phase of life, Sue has experienced a reduction in bone density. Now, this may not be notably alarming in terms of promoting osteoporosis. Sue may simply be experiencing the more mild reduction in bone density that is quite common as a result of the hormonal shifts that women undergo during this transition in life. But Sue, unbeknownst to her, may be freeing up from in situ storage in her bones a notable amount of lead. Now, lead is preferentially stored in bones, and Sue may have been exposed to ongoing sources of lead a long time ago, maybe even in her childhood or in her early adulthood. And through the constant turnover of osteoclast and osteoblast activity in her bones, she may have simply been reincorporating this lead into her bone tissue. And it has taken this long moving into this phase of life to lose enough bone density that the lead is mobilized and is now in circulation. And it's wreaking oxidative havoc on the lining of her arteries. And this, of course, can attract an inflammatory response, a repair response from human immune system. And we get into this vicious cycle of inflammation, promoting oxidative stress and damage, which promotes more inflammation and more oxidative stress and damage. It's important to remember this is a healthy repair cycle that works well if indeed the challenge ceases, as opposed to becoming a chronic part of our life experience. And so Sue, just like Bill, just like Mary, ends up with this wear and tear to the lining of her arteries, which impairs endothelial function, and her blood vessels lose their responsiveness. 3 different cases of hypertension, all equally labeled. But it's easy for any of us to see that if we want to help these 3 individuals get at the roots of their unique case of hypertension, then we need to do some assessment. We need to cast a much broader net than just looking at their blood pressure or even at the lining of their arteries. And we must customize our interventional plan that is designed to actually address the imbalance, address the blockage or the impairment or the chronic challenge that's promoting the disease, and actually make it go away so that it resolves. And therefore, the body's blood pressure or the body's functioning in a number of other areas will actually return to a more optimal state on its own. Not because a medication is forcing the body to do something unnatural, but simply because the body is choosing a different physiological or biochemical balance given the state of its system, right? You change various parameters in a system, and then the system behaves differently. And so here in our Functional Medicine for Real World Impact podcast, we are exploring a rich diversity of diagnoses or symptom profiles and what is actually promoting them upstream in the chain of causality. What are the root causes? What are the mediators? Maybe exacerbating factors. And then further, perhaps at the furthest most point upstream, what are the baseline life choices? What are the habits that are actually promoting a terrain that predisposes an individual for various types of diseases? So I thank you so much for joining us for this episode to define functional medicine. In our future sessions here on the Functional Medicine for Real World Impact podcast, we're going to be exploring a rich diversity of diagnoses, of symptoms and suffering, of upstream mediators, and even further upstream root causes and lifestyle choices that are overtly promoting disease in often unassessed, unacknowledged, and certainly unresolved detail. So please hit subscribe, and I look forward to being with you for our next session.